Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Canon 211 on the Paleocrat Diaries. I am your host for this program. My name is Jake Fowler, and I am here with a woman who needs no introduction. This is Dr. Tracey Rowland, professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame in Australia. Dr. Rowland, welcome to the program. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
How is your day? How's winter going for you?
Right now, we're being blasted by icy winds from Antarctica.
Indeed.
So, not good.
Okay. What are the temperatures like when you get blasted by those winds?
Oh, well, it would be sort of down to about 5 right now, 5 degrees Celsius. So above zero, but still quite cold.
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah.
I'm
not sure if winter gets that cold here. I'm in St. Louis.
Oh, okay.
Our winters, they sometimes do get to 0 or a shade below, but our January average hovers around like 30 Fahrenheit.
Okay.
I'm not sure what that would convert to, but nonetheless,
Yeah.
this is a very interesting dynamic because it's Monday for me and it's summertime, right? In fact, I'm sweating, and you're in winter and it's Tuesday.
Exactly. Yes.
So
Yes.
this is quite it's an interesting it's a very Catholic thing to be all encompassing in that way. Because we may be on a time limit, I would like to really just get straight to the point. I asked you to come on this program because I was absolutely enthralled with an article that you wrote in the winter 2022 issue of Communio. And the title, let's see, it's a long title, but I think it's important to say it in full. From extrinsicism to a world that denies both nature and grace, a polyphonic analysis of secularism. And you begin with this amazing quote, which is actually from the conclusion. It goes like this: "It is no surprise that reason separated from faith ends up violently irrational, or that nature separated from grace ends up grotesquely unnatural, or that history separated from ontology ends up hostile to tradition and banal." When I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, I am in for a treat. And as I worked through the rest of your article, I don't mean to flatter.
No.
Seriously, this is the sort of thing that the world needs to hear. And so hence my invitation to you to come to the show and explain for my audience and for anyone else who stumbles across this video on YouTube, what exactly are you getting at when you say that extrinsicism leads to a world that denies both nature and grace? Can you start us there?
Yeah, I think I need to backtrack to my doctoral years. When I was writing my doctorate, I came across the work of Henri de Lubac and Maurice Blondel. So the word extrinsicism, as far as I'm aware, was coined by Blondel, the French philosopher. And certainly he was the first person to really start talking about it in any depth. And an extrinsicism just means a relationship of separation. So you can have extrinsic relationships, you can have intrinsic relationships. And if the relationship is extrinsic, then there's no point of contact, really. It's sort of like a relationship of two things that are completely separate. And Henri de Lubac famously said that an extrinsic understanding of the relationship between nature and grace was a major cause of the rise of secularism in Europe. And this, of course, was extremely controversial. And it led to this debate, which is ongoing, between Catholic scholars who support de Lubac and Catholic scholars, mostly Thomists, who want to defend an account of the relationship between nature and grace, which is more extrinsicist. And it's one of the big debates of the 20th century. Fergus Carr, a Scottish Dominican, he said he thought it was the biggest debate in theology within Catholic circles in the 20th century. what I think is an easy way to understand it is to use the metaphor of a cupcake. And in fact, in the literature, the cupcake metaphor is often used. And to sort of put this in a nutshell, de Lubac's argument was that an extrinsicist account of the relationship between nature and grace is like the relationship between icing on the top of a cupcake and the cupcake. So if you ice a cupcake, the icing doesn't penetrate the dough of the cupcake. It merely sits on top as a decoration. Okay, and de Lubac's argument was that from the late scholastic period, from about the 1600s onwards, the Catholic understanding of grace was that it was a kind of top-up for nature. And this occurs because we have the Protestant Reformation, and the Protestant theologians are critical of the state of nature after the fall, and they think that nature is totally destroyed in a way. It's sort of more corrupt than not corrupt after the fall, whereas the Catholic theologians argue that even after the fall, while nature is wounded, it is still basically good. And so there develops, in that late Counter-Reformation period, this Catholic attempt to defend the goodness of nature, which was a good project. But de Lubac says in doing that, what happens is that we start to see nature and grace as two completely different things. And when I was doing my doctorate, that really resonated with me, that this had become a problem. And someone who recognized it as a problem was Cardinal Ratzinger. And in a really interesting article he published in 1969 on the conciliar document Gaudium et Spes, he said Gaudium et Spes was badly drafted. At the beginning of Gaudium et Spes, we have an account of the human person who is made in the image of God, just the image of God. Later in Gaudium et Spes, we have account of the human person made in the image of a Trinitarian God. And those sort of two parts of Gaudium et Spes are not well integrated. The document was sort of put together in a rush at the end of the Second Vatican Council so that it would get passed before the council closed. Ratzinger says he thinks that if you look at paragraph 22 of Gaudium et Spes, which is pretty much taken word for word from Henri de Lubac's book Catholicism, you do get an account of theological anthropology, which he endorses very strongly. But if you don't take paragraph 22 as your hermeneutic for the document, you can get the impression that we can have a perfectly good account of humanity, of a flourishing humanity, without the need for Christ. Christ becomes a kind of top-up for Catholics. And he said you get the impression that we don't actually need Christ. You can have him as an optional extra. It's sort of like, if you use a pizza metaphor, you can have anchovies as an optional extra if anchovies are, to your taste. So Ratzinger says that's a problem, that of seeing Christ as an optional extra. So when I was doing my doctorate and looking at the relationship between faith and culture, I thought, yes, this is a problem, that if you see nature and grace as two completely separate things, then you do get this tendency of Catholic scholars to do two things. On the nature and grace front, they try and argue on the level of nature and leaving grace marginalized in order to appeal to a non-Catholic audience. And they do the same thing with faith and reason. They try and argue using reason alone in order to appeal to a secular audience. And what happens over time is that we keep playing a game on a secular field using secular rules. and the ability to actually evangelize is diminished by that kind of strategy. So that's sort of part of the background. But then what I discovered, this article arose because there was a conference in Rochester, New York, to celebrate 5 decades of the Communio Journal. And so I wanted to write an article about what has Communio contributed to Catholic theology over those 5 decades. And I think that one of the big contributions of Communio scholars has been to try and understand the mechanics of secularism and the causes of secularism. And so I chose 4 scholars from the Communio stable who have contributed to our understanding of secularism over the years. And then what I discovered was this quotation from Robert Spemann. Now, Spemann was a great 20th century German Catholic philosopher, and he was a great defender of Cardinal Ratzinger. And he said, every speculative concept becomes internally dialectical the moment it is removed from its natural context, the moment it loses its relationship to its contrary concept. And I thought, that's brilliant. That's exactly what's happening in modernity and postmodernity. In the Catholic intellectual tradition, we have these critical couplets like nature and grace, faith and reason, history and ontology, the body and the soul. These are critical couplets that need to be kept together, that they are in a relationship with one another. And what Spemann says is that the moment you separate them, they kind of mutate, they turn in on themselves, and they become the very opposite of what they're meant to be. So reason becomes irrational, nature becomes barbaric, history becomes hostile to history, it becomes hostile to tradition. If you separate the body from the soul, what you end up with is something sort of...
It's a Gnostic sort of thing.
It's a Gnostic
right?
sort of thing, yeah. So I'm sorry if that's a bit of a kind
No,
of...
that was a wonderful introduction.
Yeah.
I do have, so I read this article 3 or 4 times. And as I confided in my wife just a short time ago, I almost understand it. So I made some notes as I went through, and I wanted to ask you about something on page 650. So I'll read a bit. I'll try to preface the remarks. This is from the section, the Italian edition's contribution to the Communio project, focusing on Augusto del Noce. And then I have a question for you, if you'll permit me.
Sure.
So what I've noticed, as you've written, is that Del Noce realized that the current affluent society, as he calls it, this bourgeois Marxist paradigm that we're living in, it seems to have its roots in the separation between faith and reason. And he sort of describes what he means by the affluent society and in what way is it Marxist and bourgeois at the same time. And then come to the first full paragraph on page 650. I'll just read it for the sake of the audience, and then I have a question for you. So Del Noce's summary of these philosophical moves is as follows. First, the reduction of ideas to instruments of production promotes the elevation of science over philosophy. Second, the demise of philosophy in turn entails a demotion of interiority. Third, the demotion or suppression of interiority sets up the human person to accept or embrace a purely materialist, that is, biochemical, approach to sexuality, voided of all sacrality, and thus sexual practices become lifestyle choices in which Greco-Christian conceptions of virtue are replaced by liberal conceptions of virtue. So far, so good. Finally, the affluent society, again, this bourgeois Marxist hybrid, becomes totalitarian as culture finds itself subordinated to politics. So my question is, in keeping with the understanding of uh, the danger of extrinsicism and bearing Spamann's quote in the back of my mind, can you help me understand how we go from the first three to
Mhm.
number four?
Okay, so with the first three, you get to the point where sexuality is no longer something sacred.
Hmm.
And so at that point, removing sexual intimacy from the realm of the sacred, from the realm of the sacramental, we end up in a situation where sexuality simply becomes a lifestyle choice. And once we end up with a view of sexuality as a lifestyle choice, then the whole moral framework of Christianity and also of Judaism just doesn't make sense anymore. The Christian concept, the Christian understanding of virtue doesn't make sense anymore. Aspects of the Ten Commandments don't make sense anymore. And so what happens is a kind of Nietzschean transvaluation of values. With the sexual revolution of the 1960s, morality isn't repudiated. There's still a conception of morality, but our understanding of morality totally changes. And you can see that today where in this field, the most moral attitude popularly conceived is one of complete tolerance of every form of sexual expression, except probably paedophilia is still a taboo. But outside of that, there's pretty much nothing that's a taboo anymore. And so going from that third stage, which was really the 1960s sexual revolution stage, to the fourth stage, what happens is that conceptions of morality completely change. And then the state moves in to, in a way, police and promote that new conception of morality. And what we then find ourselves enduring is what Del Noce called the subordination of culture to politics. So we are now in a position where the notion of the political order has completely changed. It's not just an understanding that we need a realm of the political to achieve certain things in society that individuals are unable to achieve. So most of us can't build airports, man a police force, set up our own defence forces. We need some kind of collective body to do those kinds of things. And that's a sort of old-fashioned idea of politics, whereas the new idea of politics is that the state, in fact, takes the place of Christ as the source of human redemption. So we will be saved through social engineering, not through Christ. And when we talk about social engineering, we end up in the realm of government. So we now have a conception of government as an instrument for the promotion of social engineering, not just building airports or roads, but actually reforming the human person. And when we have that situation, then people who have a different view of morality and a different view of the human person, they can find themselves being persecuted. And Del Noce predicted that we would end up in this situation.
Which to a large part does reflect the situation in the West today, right now, and
Yes.
has been for a while. Okay, that explanation was actually quite helpful. So this would be the subordination of culture to politics is what Del Noce refers to as sociologism.
Yes,
if I'm not mistaken.
that's
Okay.
correct. Yes.
That sheds a lot of light on that section. So thank you for that that explanation. And again, thanks for being so gracious with our special guests. Unexpected special guests sometimes appear on this program.
They're gorgeous.
Well, thank you. Uh, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I have some questions here. Yes. Okay. So moving through the next section, then, still considering the thought of Del Noce. Um, Continental European philosophy is not a strong suit of mine. So I wonder if you could elaborate on one of your statements. Um, you're pulling from Del Noce, and he says that Kantianism will not be able to stem the tide of sociologism because Kant will succumb to Hegel, who will succumb to Marx, and that will lead us right back where we don't want to be.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you help me understand how?
I think the shorthand version is that with Kant you get a lot of dualisms, and Communio theology is always very hostile to dualisms, and Catholic theology in general. Catholic theology is described as a both-and sort of methodology. So we get dualisms with Kant, and then from Kant to Hegel, what we get is this notion of the dialectic and the idea that you have these dualistic forces that interact with one another and create a synthesis, a new framework that then breaks down, creates new dualisms. There's another kind of intellectual conflict and a new synthesis. That's Hegel. What Marx does is to take that Hegelian notion of this dialectical conflict and he marries it to a Feuerbachian materialism. And so with Marx, the conflict becomes primarily an economic conflict. And for Marx, ideas are simply the epiphenomena of economics. So we go from Kant to Hegel, Kantian dualism to Hegelian dialectics, to Marxist dialectical materialism. And that gives us what's called old left Marxism. With the old left, because of this belief that that economics determines the way people think, the idea is that if you want to improve humanity, create a society where we're all equal and we can, in Marx's words, hunt in the morning, fish after lunch and philosophize after dinner, return to the Garden of Eden in a way. If we want to create that, then you have to go around smashing the bourgeois power bases. You have to actually enter into a revolutionary war against the middle classes and those who own the so-called instruments of production. And that's what happens in the Soviet, or what became the Soviet Union. It's what happened in Russia. And in a slightly different way, it's also what happened in China. Both the Soviet Union and China become Marxist countries after revolutionary battles. But this character called Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, he says this isn't going to work in advanced countries. It'll
You
work
mean
in
the revolutions?
Yeah, the revolutionary option isn't going to work in a place like France or Germany or the United Kingdom or the United States. What you have to do there is have a cultural battle, and you have to get your Marxists to take control of the points of cultural influence. You have to get people into universities, schools, the media, the courts, the parliaments, all the organs of society that are important cultural institutions. They have to be penetrated by Marxists. They have to be taken over by Marxists. Hence the expression, the long march through the institutions. And that was Gramsci's strategy. And that strategy has been playing out, ever since the 1960s in so-called first world countries, in advanced Western countries. So what we have are Marxist university professors, Marxist judges, Marxist teachers, and so forth. And that's what is called the new left. Whereas the old left was more concerned about battles within trade unions and economics, the new left is more concerned about sexuality, differences between men and women, so-called gender politics. And that's what we're contending with now. Yeah.
Indeed. No, thank you for that explanation as well. So that sort of brings us to the next section, which is basically Remy Brogg. How can you summarize how Brogg has contributed to Communio's diagnosis of
Yeah.
secularism?
I think Brogg's a really interesting character. He's been widely published in English, and he was influenced by Leo Strauss, who was a professor of political philosophy at the University of Chicago in the mid-20th century. Strauss had a big impact on, as I understand it, the conservative movement in the United States. But Strauss's disciples are split over their interpretation of Strauss. But one of his key issues, one of the key Straussian issues, was the relationship between Athens and Jerusalem. And that's shorthand for the relationship between faith and reason. Strauss was a Jew, and so, of course, he has to contend with that relationship, just as Catholics have to contend with that relationship. So Brogg was sort of influenced by Strauss insofar as he became interested in this relationship between the contribution of the Jews to Western civilization and the contribution of the Greeks, and the way in which Christian revelation interacts with the contributions from the Greeks and the Jews. So a number of Brogg's books are working in that space. And one of his interesting points is that he thinks that in order to understand the relationship between church and state, it actually helps to apply what are called the Chalcedonian adverbs. These are adverbs used to describe the relationship between Christ's divinity and his humanity. And there's 4 adverbs, and they are that it's a relationship without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. And applying those adverbs to the relationship between church and state, what becomes apparent is that you can end up with problematic understandings of that relationship if you don't apply those adverbs. So those adverbs help to give you a guide as to how the relationship should be. Now, if you have separation, you've got no relationship whatsoever between church and state, you have a kind of Nestorian state. You have a situation where God is not welcome in the public space. And that's sort of where we are in many of the liberal democracies today. It's a kind of Nestorian state. We can't have any sort of relationship between God or faith and reason operating in the public space. The other extreme is where you get a kind of confusion of church and state. And the typical example there would be a theocratic state. So some of the Islamic states where you have an imposition of Sharia law. That would be the example of where you've got confusion of the two. And so Brogg says, that Christianity, when it's operating well, helps to give us a kind of model for the relationship between church and state, which recognizes the distinction between the two, but keeps them in a relationship that is intrinsic, where they're allowed to interact with each other.
Yeah, what struck me as very interesting in that particular section was it was toward the beginning of that that section where you describe Brogg's insight of Christianity unites where it would be easier to distinguish
Mm-hmm.
church and state, the secular and the religious, and it distinguishes where it's easier to unite them.
Yeah,
And so I
yeah,
think in that way, that's another, maybe that's a longhand way of getting at those critical couplets that you mentioned a little
yeah,
while ago, where these
yeah.
things have to be held in dynamic tension and they
Yes.
can't be strictly separated. Unfortunately, Dr. Rowland, it looks like we have just over 5 minutes left before Zoom decides that we are finished
Okay.
speaking
All
for
right. Yes.
today.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can arrange a part two at some point in the future at your
Sure.
convenience.
Yeah.
In the last few minutes, though, I want to ask something that we sort of skipped over. This would be from the introduction.
Mm,
Uh, I want to ask you, what role has the Catholic Church had
mm.
in the rise of secularism?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, de Lubac would say that it's contributed to the rise of secularism because it's it's um, it's allowed Catholic intellectuals to really foster the idea that nature and grace, faith and reason can be separated, and that we can actually play a game on a secular field without recourse to faith, without recourse to grace. We're so smart, we're so clever. We can defend, this is like Kant wanted to do this. Kant wanted to totally separate faith and reason, although he wasn't a Catholic. But he wanted to totally separate faith and reason. And then he wanted to defend Christian morality by reference to reason alone, you know? And it just doesn't work, um, and to the extent that we have tried to do that, to the extent that we've tried to play that game, we have consistently marginalized faith and reason from public life. Sorry, faith and grace from public life. And there's some of my research recently has been on the Catholic scholars who were prominent in Germany between the two world wars. And they were having to contend with, the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche and Marx and Kant. And one of them said, we have to fight on sacramental ground. We have to be not afraid to fight on sacramental ground. To bring Christ dead into the center of the battle, and to really take seriously the idea of sacramental graces, and the idea that grace transforms the human person, doesn't just perfect the human person, but actually totally transforms the human person from within. And it's really, Nietzsche said something like, if Christians want me to believe in their God, they at least need to look as though they have been redeemed. And in a way, we have to really trust in the work of grace to redeem us, and so that we can say that being a Christian is actually a different mode of being a human being, and that it's more attractive. But for as long as we continue to go down this path of trying to say, oh, well, if you're just intelligent enough and use your reason in the right way, you can get to a Christian point without buying into belief in Christ or the Trinity or the church or, the Gospels or the whole package.
And so that strikes me as the exact thing that Communio is trying to combat.
Mm,
Like
yeah.
and this comes out through the course of your article.
Mm,
and through the journals themselves. I've got a stack of them here holding my
mm,
microphone up.
mm.
And so we're pretty well out of time. We've got just a minute and a half left. Again, time constraints due to technological constraints. Dr. Rowland, thank you once more
Mhm.
for your graciousness. Thank you for your erudition. Thank you for your contributions to Catholic theology today. Um, Folks, I want to remind you that you can check out other content similar to this at canon211.locals.com. A preview of this video goes onto YouTube, and the rest of it is in my locals community. You can join for free. And if you are so moved, you can support my family and I financially. Okay. Well, I suppose that will have to do it for today. As we always do on this show, I want to remind every one of you to never give up, to keep on smiling, and to memento mori. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you so much.